really like to welcome a good friend and our colleague, Dr. John Hancock, who's calling in from Geneva, and he has been attending these over the number of years that we've been together. So, John, good to see you, and please look forward to your remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Justin. Thanks for everyone tuning in. And I've this first page, I have this really bureaucratic disclaimer thrown up because honestly, it's a very difficult time for someone working for any of these international organizations to speak honestly or frankly about a subject. So it's great to hear it's Chatham House rules, and these will be my views, definitely my views, not the WTO Secretariat's views or views of its members. Could I have the next slide, Madeline, please? Okay, we got, I think we've been living through a period, especially, I think trade is the sharp edge of the wedge, or has been, but it's been an extraordinary year of really transformational change that's happened very quickly. But it's not without, I don't think it's not without antecedents. Sorry, I go back to my Lenin quote there. Uh, there are decades where nothing happens, and then there's weeks where decades happen. I think that kind of nicely captures what the last year has been like. It's suddenly as if the dike has broken and the world has changed. I'm also reminded that that line from The Sun Also Rises, from Hemingway's Sun Also Rises. How did you go bankrupt? Bill asked. Two ways, Mike said, gradually and then suddenly. And there is a sense that the whole international system has been gradually under pressure or under, extreme pressure for change. But the process has been so gradual, we've been reluctant to acknowledge it. And then we've suddenly seen this, dramatic change. So what I want to do today, I'm going to subject you to a couple of slides that are fresh off the press from the WTO on what the global trade picture looks like. And then I want to briefly talk about what the drivers are of change in the US, that what I think are the main drivers of change in the US. And then I want to offer some broad scenarios about where we might be headed from here. And when at the end of that, I'll try to end quickly and get this done fairly rapidly. And then let's talk and have some questions and maybe some more Canadian focused questions. So this first slide, I think I've shared it before, but I like it. It basically captures the idea that for the last 200 plus years, we have had ever deepening global economic integration, and exports as a share of GDP are a nice shorthand for economic integration. They're not perfect, but they give a nice shorthand. And what you see in this graph is simply starting in the 1800s, really starting after the Industrial Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. There's this gradual but fairly consistent slope towards deeper integration, the first age of globalization. It's cut short quite dramatically in 1914 through to 1945 because the First World War, the Great Depression, the Second World War, and all the kind of deglobalization trends that occurred during that 3 decade period. But then it resumes, and it resumes much more steeply after 1945. And again, so you go from a world of just over 5%, trade is 5% of GDP, of global GDP, to a world where we are now, which is over a quarter of GDP is trade dependent. Next slide, please. There. What I think what I want to try to portray in these two slides or two graphs is the idea that we're going through a period of reglobalization, but not, at least not yet, deglobalization. The first chart simply shows recent merchandise trade volume growth from 2019 to 2026. The red dotted line above the green line is what we had projected as early as last year to be the trajectory of trade growth, and it was quite robust if you look at it. Um, the dotted line was below the green line was what things look like after President Trump's announcement of the Liberation Day tariffs and his reciprocal tariffs regime, which looked very dire, and that's why 2025 trade growth was slower. And the green line is what we forecast now. So it's the basic message is we don't so far see any signs of deglobalization. Certainly nothing like the period, the interregnum between the First and Second World Wars. Integration has slowed, but it has not stopped. It's slowed most for merchandise trade, but not so much for services trade growth, and definitely not for digital trade growth or digitally delivered services, data, these sorts of things, which are actually kind of continuing to explode. The second chart, I think this is the one really that tells the best story. If you look at the contributions to trade volume growth by region, so this is 2023, 2024, this year, 2025, and then a projection for 2026. Just look at 2025. The yellow is Asia, so everything above zero is trade growth. And if you look at that bar, the vast bulk of trade growth is, as you might expect, occurring in Asia. Some of it is Europe. Europe is contributing to trade growth. Rest of the world in blue, partly contributing to trade growth. Where is the trade growth negative? Not surprisingly, North America. And if we could tease out the US, it would be even more stark. So the rest of the world is continuing to integrate and experience trade growth, except for North America. And that will get even worse in 2026 because we have a sense that at this stage, the full impact of the new American trade regime has not been fully realized. And this will be evident on the next slide. If we can just go to the next slide. This is, again, Asia soaring, North America flattening. If you look at that graph, purple is Asia, blue is North America. That's exports, so Asian exports soaring in 2024. How much of that is trade diversion from China that would have gone to North America is now looking for other markets in Asia? We haven't disaggregated that yet, but the basic picture on an export side is that Asia's exports continue to grow. North America, which is the blue line, are flatlining. If you look at the import side, it's an even more interesting picture. Asian imports not growing as much as their exports. That's the purple line, squiggly line in the middle. And the blue line, what you'll see in the first quarter of 2025 is a giant spike in imports. And as you would expect, this is a bunch of importers in the United States front-end loading their purchases because of fears of coming tariffs. So there was a huge surge in US imports in the first quarter and early second quarter of 2025, trying to head off the coming protective tariffs that the Trump administration was imposing. Next slide. And this is the last kind of detailed slide. As you would expect from the previous two pictures, global trade balances are continuing to widen. So, I think this is a really interesting slide. I stole this from I think the OECD. The yellow surplus, so above the line is surplus, below the line is deficit. Various regions either are running trade surpluses or running trade deficits, but the real deficits and surplus are two countries, China and the United States. China is orange or orangey red, huge surpluses. And the mirror deficits are in blue. That's the United States. Deficit, 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 deficit. So when we talk about global trade imbalances, there are global trade imbalances, but really it's a US-China imbalance on a core imbalance that is not dissipating. As a matter of fact, is increasing. Okay, next slide, please. What forces are driving the great trade disruption? The first point I want to make is that this is, at this point in time, a US-centric trade crisis, not a global trade crisis. What we're effectively seeing, if you wanted to put it in economic terms and use the gravity model of trade, the United States, from a gravity perspective, is becoming more distant. It is purposefully cutting itself off or isolating itself from the global economy. As much as every other country complains about the impact of US tariffs, and they should, and they have a right to, in reality, it's the United States is imposing these penalties on itself. And it's not just trade, as we know, right? So we've had last week we hear about the move of the United States. We've already seen the move to cut back to dramatically curtail low cost labor migration into the United States. Now we're looking at high end labor migration with the push to restrict visas in the high tech sector. And it's being mirrored in on tariffs. It's being mirrored with threats to put levies on inward flows of foreign investment and other forms of portfolio capital. The United States is cutting itself off from the global economy. Not completely, but that is the trend line. I say it's a US-centric trade crisis, not a global trade crisis. However, the impact could widen. The problem now that we're dealing with in the world is that where do the exports that used to go to the United States go? And China's export machine, as we've seen from the previous slides, has not slowed down. A lot of these the exports that would have gone to the US are being diverted to other economies, especially Europe and South Asia. Will there be a reaction against that? Will there be kind of knock-on effects where other countries say we've got to start pulling up tariff barriers to protect ourselves from this surge of low-cost imports from China? That remains to be seen. But so far, there are no signs of that or limited signs of that. What forces are driving the trade disruption from a US point of view, and I would argue potentially others? I think it would be fair to say that the US is being whipsawed or torn between two contradictory forces, drivers of disintegration and drivers of integration, divergence and convergence. Disintegration, this is not the subject of this discussion, but I think it's one of the elephants in the room. I think it's impossible to see US trade policy today without understanding the domestic social and economic divide that's opened up in the US, and of course, the political divide, the polarization. At some level, the US, in an almost Bismarckian way, is exporting its domestic inequality problem. There are large swathes of the US population feel that they've not benefited from economic change, definitely don't feel they've benefited from globalization, are to the extent they focus on it, are aware that technological change has had uneven benefits across the economy. And this widening domestic inequality is, I think, a huge driver of US trade policy. And I think it in some sense makes up the base of the Trump administration's support. Second, perceptions and related to the domestic inequality concern and the polarization concern, perceptions of deindustrializations. And it's perceptions of deindustrializations, the sense that large parts of the US manufacturing and industrial sector have been hollowed out. It's not just a perception. This has happened. The share of US manufacturing in nominal GDP, not real GDP, but nominal GDP, has declined from around 25% in the 1950s, so a quarter of the US economy was manufacturing, to just over 10% today. And especially when you consider that this is a world where not only is manufacturing shrinking as a share of GDP, but it's also this is not taking into account the impact on manufacturing employment from things like automation and including offshoring and competition from China. Just to give you a picture of that, US manufacturing employment has fallen from a peak of over 19 million in 1979 to around 13 million in early 2000, even as the US population as a whole has gone up by, approaching a quarter to a third. So if manufacturing as a share of GDP has shrunk, and manufacturing employment as a share of overall US employment has dramatically shrunk. So even if the factories came back to the United States, or some came back as a result of US trade policy, a lot of these factories would be automated. The factories would come back, but the jobs wouldn't. What should be made of that? This is a very good debate, and probably too big a debate to have now. To what extent are we seeing a real problem of deindustrialization in the United States, or are we seeing simply the natural progression of advanced economies from manufacturing-based economies to service-based economies? In the same way the United States transitioned from an agrarian-based economy to a manufacturing-based economy in the last century. A lot of people would say that's what's actually gone on. And in fact, my next point about persistent deficits, we had the slide earlier which showed these persistent deficits. It's important to stress that these are persistent deficits in goods in manufacturing trade, or in tangible trade, in goods, in raw materials, in agricultural product. It's not services trade, where the United States continues to run major surpluses. It's not rents from foreign investment abroad, where the United States continues to run a surplus, a positive balance from its numerous investments abroad. It's not the kind of stuff that Jim Balsillie talks about, the kind of rents that come from intellectual property in various forms, which again, the United States is a major is majorly on the positive side of that balance sheet. So talking about deficits, the United States definitely has continued to run a persistent manufacturing trade deficit for decades. But there are other exchanges it would appear much better. I think the fourth related driver of disintegration is China's rise, and not just the sense that China has been responsible for this deindustrialization, the offshoring of U.S. manufacturing to China, but also the geopolitical implications of an ascended China and the relative, not absolute, decline of U.S. economic power. And finally, something I'll throw in here, and I spoke about last time. There seems to be, as a disintegrating force, no unifying policy vision. We seem to have moved from a U.S. political world where there was bipartisan support for U.S. engagement in the international economic system, for freer trade, for market-oriented reforms in other countries. This was something that seemed to cross the aisle between Democrats and Republicans. In a sense, we're almost in the opposite world right now, where neither Republicans nor Democrats seem to support those planks of U.S. international economic policy in the past, and nothing has replaced it. It's not clear that there's any unifying vision for where the United States wants the world international economic system to go. The integrating forces, I'll try to be brief. Technological change, we can all grasp that. It doesn't need an explanation, and its effect on trade costs. Everything from containerization to the internet to now artificial intelligence is driving down the trade costs, making it easier to move or cheaper to move products, both tangible and intangible, around the planet, and especially intangible. That's why we see a huge growth in services trade, an even bigger growth in digitized services trade, and a more lackluster growth in manufactured goods trade. Knowledge diffusion, this could be a subject of a whole other session. the sense that the secret sauce of industrialization, what it takes to become technologically advanced, has changed as you move to a more knowledge-based economy. It's easier to move that information around the planet. When your industrial strength depended on having, local supplies of iron ore, local supplies of coal, married to huge industrial infrastructure like blast furnaces and advanced manufacturing assembly lines, it was much harder for countries to import advanced ways of doing things. The more intangible that advanced economy comes, the easier it is for those kind of technologies to shift across borders. And finally, hyper specialization and deep value chains. The US's policy lacks a unifying vision, in part because it's there just as there is a desire on the part of the administration to bring manufacturing home, to cut off over dependence on other countries. There's also an awareness that no sectors in the US economy, even an economy as big as the US, are truly independent. That the classic examples we've heard in the past several years. It requires 50 different trading partners to produce an iPhone. It took over 250 companies or value parts of a value chain to produce a COVID vaccine. Nothing can be produced by a country on its own. All countries are highly specialized in these value chains, including the United States. And this is particularly true for ideas and technology. Technology is almost the most interdependent and integrated value chain on the planet. When you delve deeply into these technology chains, you realize just how intricate they are. So that the idea that the US can somehow be self-sufficient and bring manufacturing home seems to be an illusory one. Last slide. Sorry about this, and I'll try to drive through these quickly. Where are we headed? From cooperation to competitive interdependence. I think it's now become conventional wisdom, and the U.S. would admit this. The old U.S.-led international economic system seems to be over. Here's 4 possible scenarios, purely on my speculation of what we could face in the year. 1, breakdown of a rules-based order and a return to a power-based world. The great powers, US, China, EU, etc., will increasingly seek to carve out regional spheres of influence. Lacking the means to counterbalance the great powers' gravitational pull, middle and smaller sized economies will be forced to choose which side they're on. Scenario 1. Scenario 2, breakdown of the rules-based international order, but no one is in charge and no one is dominant. In a more anarchic world with fluid alliances, middle and smaller economies have an opportunity to play the great powers off against one another to maximum advantage. 4th scenario, the rules-based order continues, but increasingly without the US. In the pursuit of greater self-sufficiency and fewer global ties, the US pulls back from the international economic system while the rest of the world carries on. Leadership becomes more multipolar, and the center of gravity continues to shift eastward and southward. 4th, the rules-based global order enters one of its periodic transformations or reinventions. Just as Nixon upended the Bretton Woods system, Trump is overturning the post-Cold War system. The shock highlights how the old system had been made obsolete by globalization, deeper integration, power shifts, new issues on the agenda like AI, which will either lead to deep reform of the current system or the rise of an entirely new, more Pacific-centrist and China-led system. I'm going to wrap it up there. Those scenarios, I'm sure, are not hermetically sealed. I'm sure one bleeds into another. No one knows what's around the corner. That's the truth. One of the things that's unique about these periods of dramatic transformation is that our forward vision is highly limited. But I'm going to leave it there. I'm happy to answer any questions either about the trade outlook or about the speculation. Also, I think it would be worth talking about, maybe briefly talking about what this means for Canada and Canada's current current negotiations with the U.S.
Thank you so much, John.